Hello and welcome to Gladio for Europe. I am your host for today, Liam, joined here by Sam B.
Hello.
And Russian Sam.
Hey.
Last week, we introduced our upcoming Interwar series, and we're really excited to get into the politics and culture of that period. But before we go to the 20s and 30s, we wanted to do one more episode going back a few centuries earlier. Because, we love ancient and medieval history too, as I'm sure all of our listeners are well aware. And we realized that one of the most important topics of early medieval history has never actually been tackled head-on by our podcast. That's a specific culture from the early Middle Ages, which would leave an incredibly long-lasting mark on the later history of Europe and much of the world at large. That culture happens to be the ancient Franks, and we are incredibly lucky this episode to be joined by an amazingly knowledgeable guest named Natasha at Bone 30, who's joining us this afternoon.
Real heads also know her as Sarmatian Queen.
That's true. I am the Sarmatian Queen. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha, like Liam just said.
Well, first, thank you so much for joining us today. This is such a huge topic. I'm so excited to get into this, and I'm so lucky we have your help to talk about the Franks. Could you just start off explaining a little bit about your work and your background and where your interests lie?
So it's interesting because I've always loved history, but I'm actually a graduate student studying microbiology, and that's mostly genetics work. And so there's a lot of phylogeny, seeing how things have evolved and how they're related. And there's actually a lot of parallels between the rise of ancient DNA and how we track the changes in peoples, the relatedness, the admixture, right? So there's all of those things pretty easily translate, even though, I'm working with a simple microbial genome versus a complex eukaryotic human genome, but it's very similar. And I'm also really familiar with a lot of the techniques to extract ancient DNA is very complicated. So I can always appreciate the science behind ancient DNA work as well. But I've always been interested in history, really been interested in the Bronze Age, and then also basically everything up to the Renaissance in particular. So I'm also really interested in, say, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans as well.
All the fun stuff. And you are really well-versed in all of this, I have to say. I know Natasha through a lot of history chats, and Natasha's always there to, clue in everybody with any kind of medieval lore. So the Franks especially are just a really interesting topic, only because Frankish society would touch so many other aspects of Europe across the fall of the Roman Empire up throughout the early, late Middle Ages. As some of our listeners might know, the Franks, who are sort of seen as the cultural ancestors of the modern French people, were in fact originally a Germanic-speaking culture that lived beyond the Roman frontier of the Rhine. In the Roman understanding, these guys were the classic long-haired barbarians. The Franks were understood by Roman citizens as a primitive and a violent people who weren't suitable for participation in any kind of civilized society. So the big irony here is that these barbarians, who were understood as the antithesis of all that was Roman, would eventually themselves become essentially the bearers of the Roman legacy in the Middle Ages in Europe. Traditionally, modern European historians basically took the Roman view of the Franks as barbarians at face value, and due to the rapid rise of Frankish power around the same time that Roman power was falling, traditionally the Franks were implicated in the fall of Rome itself. At the same time, due to their long-standing power in the centuries after the fall of Rome, the Franks were also credited for the empire's replacement with the new medieval world order. Like we said, the name of the modern country of France obviously takes its name from the ancient Franks, even though, as we're going to talk about in this episode, not as much as you might expect of this ancient Frankish culture is actually present in modern France.
Especially not the language.
Right, especially not the language. So it brings up these really interesting questions about culture and identity and the ways that modern groups sort of relate to their history.
Well, I just like to talk about the word Frank because we know it as free And the Latins knew it as, in the Latin language, it became known as free, free man. But most likely, it was not that to the people, of course. And it's actually really interesting because there's a potential parallel with the Saxons, right? So the name of the Saxons came after their famous weapon, right? Their knife, yeah. And so it's very likely that the Franks were actually named after their own weapon, because there are cognates in Old English, in Old North, a fracca, I think, it's like a javelin. And so it's very likely that that's where their actual name came from. So, there's a really interesting idea, like how many of these Germanic tribes, these Germanic peoples, called themselves or were called by their peers based on their favorite weapon, right? It's an interesting little piece of culture, right? It's a glimpse into their culture, how they may have perceived each other.
And there might even be some cool continuity there with the ancient Franks and the medieval Franks, because, as I'm sure you know, centuries later, around the Carolingian period, the Franks were associated with another thrown weapon, the Francesca throwing axe.
Exactly, and you throw a javelin. Exactly,
yeah. So there might be some kind of link there. Yeah, they love throwing. A very projectile people. The Franks certainly would project their power all across Europe, obviously. You see the name Frank in place names as far east as Eastern Germany, if not Poland, maybe. Places like Frankfurt are everywhere. I think that probably the most fun legacy of the word Frank is the fact that because Frankish power was so overwhelming in Western Europe throughout the late Middle Ages, until the late Middle Ages, the name Frank became a byword for Westerner that's used all throughout the world today. So as far east as Indonesia and Thailand, any European is called Farang, which means Frank, because the people from India learned the word Frank from the Arabs, who learned it from the Byzantines, whose main encounters with Western Europeans were with Franks. So it's a really kind of, you can see right there that even though this culture no longer exists in any meaningful way, they've got this really interesting legacy here. So we talked about the kind of the vision of Franks as barbarians. The other vision by Romantic nationalists a little bit later understood the Franks as sort of more of a noble savage type. These people who might have been barbaric, but they also established this beautiful Catholic order, which is the view that a lot of right-wing French nationalists sort of take to this day. But these days, modern historians are much less likely to either praise or condemn the ancient Franks for their role in the fall of Rome, because these days it's increasingly less likely for the Franks to be implicated in the fall of Rome at all. More recent research has suggested that the role between Franks and Roman elites was much more collaborative than destructive. Not all historians agree with this, but as we're going to get into in this episode, the Frankish people would have an intimately close relationship with the Roman Empire and the later Roman legacy, which is part of why it's so interesting to talk about how this group of people, who at one point would have been as barbarian as they come, ended up becoming essentially synonymous with the medieval legacy of Roman authority. I guess the best way to get started with this is to talk about when we have the first references to people called Franks crossing the Rhine and entering the Roman Empire. And we're going back to a period we talked about in our last ancient episode a couple weeks ago, which is the notorious crisis of the 3rd century.
So the best evidence that we have is one of the first known references to the Frankish people is this Roman marching song from the crisis of the 3rd century, which goes like this. 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, we've beheaded now. One alone, 1,000 we've beheaded now. He shall drink 1,000 who 1,000 slew. So much wine is owned by no one as the blood which he has shed. And Franks, Sarmatians by the 1,000, once and once again we've slain. Now we seek 1,000 Persians.
Right, and I love that, because that really shows a lot about what the very early relationship with the Franks and the Romans was going to be. It does seem like at the start it was very antagonistic. You know, the early Franks were probably engaged in small-scale conflicts with other Germanic tribes that might have been allied with Rome. We talked in the last episode about a Roman general named Postumus, who was part of a group called the Batavi, who tended to be a lot more Roman-aligned. The Batavi seemed like they were long-term enemies with the Frankish people, but that wouldn't always be the case. And eventually, the Franks would have a much more significant role to play in medieval history than the Batavi would.
Is that where the word Batavian comes from? Like the Batavian Republic?
That is, yeah. So there's an interesting parallel there with, the way that the Franks are claimed by later French people as their cultural ancestors. The Dutch would go on to claim the much less impressive Batavi, which I think actually says maybe a little bit about French versus Dutch politics in the world stage. Okay, but to keep going, it does seem like the Franki in the 3rd century invaded Rome in some capacity, and it's really hard to know in what capacity this was. Earlier, I might even say less responsible generations of historians assumed it was a very straightforward case of, during this crisis, the Franks come in and they never leave. To some extent, that might be true. There might have been a continuous Frankish presence within the Roman province of Gaul after the 3rd century, but it's sort of hard to know. Guy Halsall, who's a historian I like a lot, who I'm going to be leaning on very heavily for this episode, is a little bit skeptical that there would have been any kind of large-scale migration into Gaul during this period. He looked pretty hard at the archaeological evidence, and what he found is that across the 3rd century, you definitely start to see a turn towards more fortification in Gaulish towns and villages. Many historians had assumed that this meant that these towns were suddenly dealing with a new foreign threat, potentially, Frankish barbarians. I think the best example of this is that in the city of Tours, that we'll mention at the end of the episode, their amphitheater was actually turned into a fortress, which is kind of crazy. So there does seem to be some sort of serious security threat. In addition, the Historia Augusta reports that around 260, the Franks burst into Gaul and were roving about the whole country. And it even seems like they might have gotten as far as Tarragon in eastern Spain. So there are some historical references to people called Franks invading Gaul in this period. So with this evidence up here, it's really easy to see the Franks as classic barbarians, these long-haired bandits invading and plundering a more civilized Roman world. But what Guy Halsall notes is that if you look a little bit closer, you don't see the signs you might expect to see of a rampaging barbarian army.
At least not in the 3rd century.
Yes, not in the 3rd century. Much later you might, but not here. Because although you do start to see fortifications popping up, they don't only happen on the border. Instead, actually, these fortifications happen everywhere, which seems to imply that this isn't necessarily a defense against a barbarian threat, but it might be a broader trend toward militarization. As we talked about, there were so many constant civil wars during that period that barbarians probably weren't the most immediate threat to Roman citizens. Instead, other Roman armies might have been. In addition, one thing we'll talk about a lot in this episode are burials and grave goods. And that while you definitely do start to see some Germanic-style burials happening within Roman territory after the 3rd century, suggesting that some foreign Germanic-speaking peoples were being buried in Rome, the biggest economic movement actually is not of Germanic goods coming into Rome, but it's overwhelmingly Roman goods moving into Germania. So what this suggests, according to Guy Halsall, is not a barbarian invasion, but a more chaotic situation in which an increasingly militarized Roman world, torn apart by civil war, steels itself against internal threats more than barbarian invasion, and may in fact use the assistance of barbarian mercenaries rather than invaders to deal with these various internal threats. We talked about what happened after the reforms of Aurelian and Diocletian, when the Roman Empire became increasingly powerful on the local level, especially due to the division between 2 or 4 emperors. Another major factor was that the Roman military would increasingly rely on barbarian and especially Germanic-speaking auxiliaries. So more recent generations of historians think that in the 3rd century, while you do start to see some Frankish intrusion into the province of Gaul, it's not so much as invaders and settlers, but rather mercenaries who were probably offered some kind of land or wealth in exchange for military Roman service. And this is a process you're going to see up until the very end of the Roman period. And so this leads us to a big question here. After the fall of Rome, you see this Latin-speaking Roman Empire be replaced by a patchwork of essentially barbarian kingdoms that were initially Germanic-speaking. There is a really big transition here from the end of the Roman period to the start of the medieval period. So the big question is, which is really the primary question for the first half of this episode, how did this shift happen? What role did barbarians play in the fall of Rome? Were they these destructive invaders like we talked about, who completely abolished the Roman legacy for good or for ill, depending on your perspective? Or is it more likely that Rome essentially fell on its own accord, and the Franks and the Visigoths and all those groups were left holding the bag?
I mean, I think the question with the word invasion, it pervades all history discussions when you have peoples moving. There's always been a long trend to view, well, it had to be violent. It had to be by force. It had to be unwanted. But, there's a lot of dynamics we don't know about. Obviously, we do know that the Romans did hire a lot of Germanic and other non-Germanic mercenaries. But also at the same time, there's a suggestion that there could have been an economic depression. And when that happens, you will become friendlier to other groups if you can help build capital. I mean, that's a little modern term for this, through those connections. So there's a lot of peaceful ways that over a century, a group like the Franks could move into Gaul, and without even realizing it, they've become a dominant force in the region without violence whatsoever.
Right, and I think that, and I think that the best example we have for this kind of non-violent movement, which would have been a genuine movement of peoples, is the fact that one of the most fun emperors that we've talked about, who I know you're a big fan of, Julian the Apostate.
He tried so hard, man.
He established the Franks as a federati of the empire. We might have touched on what federati were in the last episode, but basically it means that they are a community, usually with some kind of cultural or kinship ties, that are allowed to move into the Roman Empire, settle within the borders, and basically have their own autonomous sort of barbarian culture within Rome. And this seems to be the most likely type of demic movement of individuals you would have, or at least the most important movement of individuals you would have seen during this period, rather than, invaders coming to plunder and never leaving. Instead of coming to invade, they probably were settled deliberately to increase Roman authority in this area. Because, if you have problems with barbarians on the other side of the border, the best way to protect yourself is some barbarians on your side of the border to fight for you. And like we said, this is basically the story of the Franks from here on in. They are going to be a federati of the Roman Empire, and generations upon generations of Frankish people are going to fight for, not against, the Roman Empire. This was an incredibly widespread process, and we really start to see in this period barbarian groups from all across Northern and Western Europe are hired to fight for Rome, even peoples from very far afield. In the book Children of Ash and Elm, Neil Price mentions that in the late Roman period, you even start to see Roman-style burials in Denmark and Norway, which suggests that some of these individual mercenaries fighting for Rome might have been recruited from as far afield as Scandinavia. A lot of our listeners are probably familiar with the Varangian Guard of the later Byzantine Empire. You can make the argument that that's the last stage of this very long process of barbarian groups being recruited by Rome to, support their interests.
And I'd just like to add that, it's hard to see it now, but in this time, the Norse and the Saxons and the Franks were barely distinct groups. I mean, they had only really recently begun spreading out. Their languages were all still very closely related. It's very plausible that there was exchange between the various larger, the individual tribes, and then the larger groups like the Ingvaonic and whatnot. So it's very possible and plausible that that sort of thing would happen from the groups that became the Scandinavian tribes, right? So that's not surprising when you think of the big picture.
Yeah, and even though it might seem really far to get from France to Norway, if you were a culture that happens to be quite good at sailing across the North Sea, even on a small scale, that might not be at that hard of a journey. So we don't know too much about the specifics of this process of settlement and military service, but it is clear that two things happened. First, a group of people called the Franks did start to live in Gaul. And second, this group of people became increasingly influenced by the Roman society that they were living within. One thing that I find really interesting is that a lot of the material culture we associate with Germanic barbarian peoples, even basically up to and including the Vikings, actually has its roots in the late Roman period. We talked a little bit about the way that medieval aesthetics are basically late Roman aesthetics. A really good example of that is the fact that the famous Viking sword is essentially identical to a Roman gladius. It's not based on earlier ancient Norse Iron Age models. It's based on Roman models. All across the North Sea, you see helmets that are also made in this kind of Roman style. A lot of us might know that famous Sutton Hoo helmet found in Britain, this Anglo-Saxon helmet from like the 6th or 5th century. Although the design is incredibly Germanic, with like the little images of monsters and dragons, the form of the helmet itself is basically identical to Roman military gear. Some historians even believe that the stereotype of Germanic-speaking barbarians as particularly warlike is itself just a consequence of Roman military service.
Well, the stereotype, it goes back once again to Tacitus. As far as I know, he was writing in the 1st century CE, so this would have been before there would have been that many Germanic peoples integrated into the Roman military. But nevertheless, it does seem to me pretty indisputable that this period only really cemented this image for Germanic peoples going forward.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And whether or not this sort of military culture existed prior to Roman contact, by the Roman period, this stereotype, like you said, was obviously there. One thing that I find really interesting that Patrick Wyman, who we're a big fan of, talked about ages ago on his podcast, is that it seems like the traditional lavish barbarian burials where a warrior is interred with all of his weapons and armor seems to itself be connected to Roman contact. Because the only reason why these peoples would have had all of these grave goods, which, as we mentioned, oftentimes were based on Roman designs, if not Roman made, was because of this extensive Roman contact. These local chiefs were on both sides of the Roman frontier, were building up their wealth due to their military service for the Roman Empire. So there's this really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship going on here, which again only further complicates the relationship between barbarians and Romans in the last centuries of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, but again, it seems to me like grave good culture seems to have been present in the region for well over 1,000 years at that point.
There are definitely earlier barrows going from into the Bronze Age, but I do think you seem to see a lot more of these and a lot more lavish burials during this period.
I mean, I think it's really complicated to say because when you look at what we know about the cultures after they became more distinct on their own, they do tend to be not war-based, but they do clearly value that. I mean, and of course, all cultures to an extent do. You know, if you become successful and you know, conquer new lands, like say the Saxons or the Norse, right? I think it's really hard. That's one of those things that's really hard to say when the first several centuries of knowing about these groups is solely through an outsider. So, I mean, it's really hard to know. And I do agree with Rush and Sam about grave goods because, I mean, obviously with the trade exchange, yes, their grave goods became more Roman influenced, but, you know, grave goods didn't. These groups probably had grave goods. I mean, certainly had grave goods before their interactions with the Romans. So I think it's just really hard to untangle all of the Roman influence from our perspective of the Franks and the other Germanic people.
Of course, I think that the best evidence for a sort of a Romanization happening is that apparently you actually only see these kinds of Frankish lavish burials only on the Roman side of the border. You do not see immediately east of the Rhine these kinds of burials. You see them elsewhere in the Germanic-speaking world, but it seems like in the area around the Netherlands where the Franks would have come from, they were only doing cremation prior to crossing the Rhine, which is interesting. But again, it's hard to know what's going on here exactly. It's hard to know to what extent the peoples east of the Rhine saw themselves as connected to the peoples west of the Rhine. They might have both been Frankish groups. They might have not. It's hard to know. It does seem like there was kind of a gap there. We're going to talk more about archaeology in a second, but on the topic of grave goods, Russian Sam, I know you're a big fan of one specific tomb. If you want to spend a minute to talk about that.
All the way back in the 17th century, some workers discovered this really massive grave while they were working on a site near Tournai. I think that's in modern-day Belgium. And so they unveiled this very elaborate burial, which, as it turns out, belonged to a man named Childeric, who was the grandfather of Clovis, who was the one who really created a Frankish kingdom, which is what people generally associate with the Franks. And Odoric, he was buried with a bunch of these great accoutrements. There was a bunch of grave goods, of course, because that's what you do. He had a gold ring, which read in Latin, of the King Childeric, and it featured a portrait of some kind of a long-haired man, maybe that's supposed to be Childeric.
Right. And we should mention that one of the only consistent descriptors you see in ancient references to the Franks is the fact that supposedly their kings had long hair, which was very important to them.
And Childeric, this was someone who lived all the way in the middle of the
5th century, so right before or right during the fall of Rome. But, Russian Sam, I think you're forgetting the most famous part of this burial. What was also buried in this tomb?
Yeah, so in this tomb, there were also a bunch of these flies or bees.
Yeah, hundreds of them.
Yeah, made out of gold and these red stones for the wings. They're very, very pretty. And this came to be something that Napoleon personally became interested in because...
you can see them on his coat of arms.
Yeah, so the bee symbol became this lasting symbol of France. What I think is interesting that we should mention here, which is something you see time and time again, is that although this is an ancient Frankish symbol associated with later French politics, there isn't really a continuous history there. This was basically Romantic nationalism, not a kind of it was a romantic gesture towards the past rather than this continuous legacy.
Yeah, Napoleon was extremely worried about legitimate, especially at the beginning, about legitimacy and having a clear line back.
Yeah. And, on the topic of the bees, before we move on. So like you said, in the 17th century, these bees were discovered and they were the symbol of French royal power pretty much for almost 200 years. But then one night, there was a robbery. And these, which were basically considered the French crown jewels, were stolen. And some anonymous bastard grabbed almost all of these hundreds of golden bees, and they were never found again. And then on the way out of the royal library where they were held, 2 of them were dropped. So only 2 of these bees are left. And these bastards stole hundreds of these little golden bees to, melt them down or whatever, and we're probably never going to find them again. So that
sucks.
To add to that really fast about the Frankish mythology, of course, there is theories that it could be actual Germanic mythology based, but there's also an argument that these could be a reference to Artemis, right? So the bees of Artemis. And we don't know, right? Because there was so much exchange, right? So we can't, that's a big thing about understanding Frankish mythology. It's hard to tear apart what could be, Greco-Latin influence, but also what is just similarities between the larger Indo-European mythology, right? Because obviously all Indo-European cultures have a through line with the mythology, yes. So it's really hard to tear these fine little knots apart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what makes it even more difficult is the fact that that most writers at the time, both pagan and Christian writers, didn't have much interest in recording the religions that were practiced by barbarians. Instead, they really just wanted to equate barbarian religions with the Roman pantheon. I guess this really kind of a lot of this previous discussion points to the broader question about, to what extent did foreign barbarians settle in the Roman Empire, especially in Gaul?
And what impact did that have?
Exactly. Or I think we know the impact, because we know that a group called the Franks would become politically dominant in Gaul and end up basically establishing a state or a polity that would pretty much continue up until the present day. It's one of the most continuous political legacies in Europe. But the question is, to what extent was this political legacy and this cultural shift connected to a change in population and genetics? And so these days, this question is a little bit easier to answer because we do have now, as I'm sure you can talk about, Natasha, this explosion in archaeogenetic research. Unfortunately, the Frankish period in Gaul is not especially well researched, so we're going to rely a lot more on other sources, but really it seems like the jury's out. Just to quickly go through the archaeology a little bit more, it's really hard to know in the archaeological record if foreigners are moving in, especially during the 4th and 5th centuries after the crisis of the 3rd century. There was this one kind of house that was traditionally associated with Germanic-speaking peoples, called a pit house or even a grub house, depending on which language you're taking this word from. And traditionally, the spread of these houses throughout Northern Europe was assumed to represent the spread of Germanic-speaking peoples, because it seems like most of the peoples living in these houses spoke Germanic languages. But pretty interestingly, recent evidence has actually shown that the first houses of this style are not found in the, Germanic-speaking heartland in modern-day Germany or the Netherlands, but instead in Gaul itself, which seems to suggest that these houses you see that are associated with Germanic speakers might have originated among the Franks themselves, or other peoples living in the Northern Roman Empire. So it seems like that some evidence that we once thought indicated settlement no longer indicates that. But again, though, we do have genetics these days, which can be a really valuable tool. Before we get started with these couple studies, anything you want to share about about how autosomal DNA and haplogroups work, Natasha, and also what kind of pitfalls there might be with using genetic data to understand the past?
Right. So when you do ancient DNA, you're working with really, really old remains, and most of the DNA will be gone. So when they do ancient DNA, they're looking for a tiny little bone in the ear called the petrous bone, which is really, really dense. And they grind it up and they hope that that really dense bit of bone will yield enough DNA. And often it's not complete DNA. So that's something to keep in mind, right? So ancient DNA, even in the petrous bone where it's well protected from the environment, will degrade over time because DNA is not stable. However, you can still get a lot out of it, but you do have to keep in mind that the perspective is not always it's not a full perspective, right? So with the Y chromosome, of course, you get the view of the male line, but not anything from the female line. And autosomal DNA, it at the same time, it doesn't tell the full story because it just depends on how large that group is, right? So some haplogroups are larger than others, right? Mutations have not arisen as frequently in that group compared to others, while there are certain haplogroups where there's a very distinct mutation and you can immediately point to that, right? So, I mean, that's the thing with all of the Yamnaya and the Bellbeakers, right? There's just like two main haplogroups that have spread over, 1.5 continents. And that doesn't actually tell you that much, right? It tells you that these people were all related at some point, but if the haplogroups had more mutations and were more divided, you would have a better picture of the story, right? So you don't really know, because it's also potentially when the Germanic peoples, developed as a culture, as a distinct group, they could have had a lot of exchange with Celtic groups in the centuries preceding. So you don't really know how different those groups were in the first place, right?
Because genetics can't really tell us how somebody identified or how somebody was identified by others.
Right. I mean, it's really good for in the case of, like you say, you have the Huns coming in from Central Asia. They're going to be distinct enough to really show up. But when you're talking about these groups in Northern and Western Europe that are probably not that distinct in the first place, it makes it a lot... you have to be much more fine fine tooth comb with it, right? Which I think the papers here do pretty well. You'll notice that they don't make strong conclusions because it's hard to make strong conclusions sometimes, right?
Yeah, and I guess if we want to talk about these papers, yeah. So like we said, there isn't a ton of research on the specific topic of genetic change during the Frankish period and the fall of Rome. I think there's kind of a sort of a gap there. But what we found was that a couple things that muddied the picture unfortunately without giving us that much of a clearer view of what this migration actually looked like. Because there was one paper published in the European Journal of Human Genetics last year which found that there is a strong north-south genetic division in France. That peoples in northern France, as you might expect, much genetically closer to peoples in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands than people in southern France are. It's this pretty stark shift that you see, especially north of the Loire River. So from one perspective, you can say, oh, that's easy. These people in northern France are related to people in the Netherlands and Germany because their ancestors were the Franks who came from those countries. That's the kind of the easy way out. But we can't really assume that's the case because especially we don't know when this north-south divide started. Was it because of the Franks in the late Roman period in the early Middle Ages, or was it different? Did this gradient exist earlier or before? There was actually another article published just a few months afterward, which found that yes, that north-south gradient actually existed several centuries before the Franks came onto the scene, which suggests that migrations of Frankish peoples in the late Roman period didn't really dramatically change the genetic landscape of France, because you seem to see the same broad trends in the Celtic period as you do in modern France today. But we have other forms of information, of data too, that might be able to tell us something about migration. There was this ASU study in 2015 of skeletal remains, which again is often a little bit less reliable. But what this study found was that although the French gene pool is somewhat diverse, there's a lot of influence from Northern Europe and from Southern Europe and the Mediterranean all over, there doesn't seem to be any substantial change during the late Roman era or the early Middle Ages, which suggests that we know for a fact that some peoples calling themselves Franks moved into the Roman Empire. It does not have seemed to have been in enough numbers to substantially transform the observable genetic and archaeological legacy of the people living there, which I think is very interesting because it suggests that these groups of people managed to become the dominant rulers of a pretty large area. Gaul is massive without actually existing in large numbers themselves.
So I think a good comparison would be, of course, England, Britain. So these kind of studies, these ancient DNA studies, are obviously interesting to a lot of groups lately. But in Europe, there has been a lot of interest to know, especially in this time period, like how much change actually came from these sorts of post-Roman movements. And so in the case of England, of course, they wanted to know, well, how much Anglo-Saxon ancestry do we actually have? How much Norse ancestry do we actually have? And it turns out it was actually a lot less than they would have expected. But what makes that really interesting, though, is in England, as we all know, since we're speaking it, the Anglo-Saxons successfully transferred their language to the entire population, even though it seems like their genetic effect was limited to the east. Right. East Anglia is the highest at, I believe, 35% admixture, right? So even though they did not admix as much throughout the rest of England, they successfully spread their language to everywhere but Wales and Cornwall, right? In England itself. And then later to Scotland, but that's another point. But that's a good comparison to the Franks because they did not successfully spread their language.
Yes, and we'll close off this episode with a little bit of talk about language, but yeah.
Yes, I won't spoil too much of it, but when you look at that comparison, right? So the Anglo-Saxons they did not admix that much, but yet they also were successful in spreading their language. The Franks did not spread their language, and then also do not appear to have admixed that much. So it's an interesting perspective. But I think also what you have to keep in mind is that the Franks did not just rule France, right? And of course, I think that's more the perspective that we're missing, because we are focusing on the development of France ultimately. But most of them stayed in the Low Countries and northern Germany, and that's where they actually left their mark, so to say, and actually left their language influence.
Yeah, linguistically, yeah, of course, because the Dutch language is, as far as I can tell, the direct descendant of the Frankish language.
Yeah, and I believe. I mean, I don't have a study in front of me, but I also believe they left a larger genetic imprint in that area as well.
Yeah, I would expect. Yeah. And I guess so. Well, that's kind of begs an interesting question. If the ancient Franks didn't migrate into Rome in large enough numbers to leave a substantial genetic effect on Gaul, then why do you think they were the ones able to have basically complete control over Gaul by the start of the 7th century or the 6th century?
I mean, they had there were peoples, right? So again, Francia included large amounts of Germany now. So they had power across a large region, and so they may have just used the actual power they had to, manage the France part of Francia. And they did not admix as much with the Gallo-Romans, right? So perhaps the people who did go there to manage the French part of Francia just did not leave an imprint, right? If they were an elite group.
So you're thinking that they might have existed in larger numbers than we expect, but it's just not there genetically.
Yeah, that's always something you have to think about, right? You always have to consider, especially if they eventually, they never really made an effect. They could also have moved back, right, over time. You also have to consider how the nobility came up, because very quickly the other nobility in the French-speaking part of Francia spoke Old French, right, or late Latin or Old French, a Romance language, yes. So they very quickly got an elite class in Francia, the French part of Francia, itself to be under them, right? So, there's a lot of military and political and economic dynamics that come into play to cement them in power in that region, even if they don't have that many Franks themselves, right?
I think that by whatever process Frankish peoples did enter the empire, and in however many numbers, I think it's clear that the process of, the foederati serving Rome as participants in the Roman Empire rather than invaders who participated in Roman society in a lot of different ways is what established this Frankish power. And that even if the Franks themselves might or might not have been numerous in number, because they existed as a federate kingdom, essentially, with their own political authority, they were an existing power structure that was able to fill the gap in Gaul once Rome fell. And eventually Rome was going to fall, because during the 5th century, as I'm sure our listeners know, the Romans faced another crisis, which at this time they couldn't really recover from. A big part of this crisis, which is actually a great case study that tells us a lot about how Frankish power might have expanded, was the crisis of Alaric, who I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with. If anyone's not familiar, Alaric was a Gothic general who led another federati of Visigoths in the Eastern Roman Empire, and he probably spent a lot of his career warring against other barbarians on behalf of Rome, sometimes even warring against other federati during intra-imperial conflicts where different federati barbarian factions fought on different sides of a civil war. One cool thing that you pointed out, Natasha, about Alaric is that he was from the Balkans.
So, right, in the previous episode, you talked a lot about how in the crisis of the 3rd century, there were a lot of briefly lived Balkan-born Roman generals who became Roman emperors. So I think it's a really interesting perspective that, a century and a half later, you have a Gothic general who came up as a federati, but yet had greater allegiance to his Gothic origins than to his adopted Roman origins, right? So he ends up representing the Goths rather than becoming a Roman emperor.
Right. And I guess the big thing for him was that he wanted to move up even higher within the ranks of Roman military authority. He really wanted to be the Magister Militum, which was kind of like the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Rome, but he was passed up. And because he was passed up for this position, he just threw a fit and immediately started plundering across Greece and Italy with his army. And so his army would have included a lot of Gothic speakers, but it probably would have included a lot of non-Gothic Roman soldiers too. And across time, it sort of snowballed, and a lot of other non-Gothic groups joined, which again further complicates the matter. But in any case, across Alaric's rebellion, he would eventually be proclaimed as King of the Visigoths, which is kind of interesting. And so one little note here, a lot of people assume that by being proclaimed king, Alaric was declaring independence from Rome, but we actually don't know if that was the case, because as we're going to see, kingdoms can and would exist underneath Roman authority, basically as middlemen between the lower nobility and the peasants and the Roman office on top.
Yeah, that continued in the East, I think, for a bit too, like with the Armenians, for example.
The Armenians, yeah. Probably the most famous, client king is King Herod. There's a couple of them who ran Judea under Roman authority around the time of Jesus. And so Guy Halsell here has a pretty interesting quote about what being a king might have actually meant in this time to Alaric. And he seems to think that a lot of the kingdoms that would exist in early medieval Europe began not as independent entities after the fall of Rome, but as entities underneath Roman authority before the fall of Rome.
5th century history is one of repeated failure by various factions to consolidate a position at the heart of the empire. Failure usually led merely to a retreat into de facto autonomy in the region where one's power base was located, and frequently the assumption of the title of king. This suggests that the grand narrative of the attempt by the barbarians to conquer lands and create independent kingdoms within the empire is, fundamentally, empirically mistaken. I cannot find any support for the idea that kingship was the preferred aim of any quote-unquote barbarian leader in the 5th century. And let's remember that most of the so-called barbarian leaders in the 5th century were actually born and raised within Roman territory. Yeah, Guy Halsell, he's not having it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Alaric is a great example of this because it seems like the entire time he was warring with Rome, up until the part where he famously sacked Rome in 410, which was the first time Rome had been sacked in 800 years or something, since the Gauls centuries before. The whole time, he was still trying to be Magister Militum, it seems like. He really thought that he could exist underneath Roman authority. I think the most interesting thing about Alaric is that he even tried to prop up a new Roman emperor that he saw as his superior. The guy would have probably been kind of a puppet leader, but he still seemed to think that he needed to exist as part of the Roman military underneath an emperor, which is really interesting.
Yeah, he wanted to be part of this order.
Exactly. And eventually Alaric would die really soon after the successful sack of Rome, so he never got his wish, but the Visigothic, sort of wandering kingdom he had created eventually would settle as a long-standing political institution. This would be the Visigothic kingdom of Gaul, which would encompass a lot of southern Gaul around the city of Toulouse, and eventually come into Hispania as well. And this is the best documented barbarian kingdom existing underneath Roman authority. There probably was a Frankish person calling himself a king, but it's hard to know what kind of political structure it would have had in the north of Gaul. But in the south of Gaul, there really was this kingdom. But what's interesting is that even though there was a Gothic kingdom now in Gaul, this doesn't really mean that it was no longer part of the Roman Empire. Because again, it's hard to know how much power the Romans had on the ground, but the Visigothic kingdom existed on behalf of Roman authority, pretty much. They were sort of like middlemen, because there was a Roman Latin-speaking nobility at the lowest levels of power, and the empire at the top. And the Visigoths would have been basically taking the place of some kind of governor, as connecting the nobility with the empire. And there's a lot of talk about what the relationship would have been between the kings, these barbarian kings, and the nobility. And one of the most interesting and also controversial theories comes from the historian Walter Goffart in the 80s.
Goffard suggested that the Visigothic kingdom was more of a legal fiction than an actual kingdom in the medieval sense, by which he means that the Gothic landowners would have owned large swaths of territory in Gaul and Hispania on paper, but in practice this only meant that they were entitled to a share of the taxes collected on that territory. And Latin-speaking aristocrats still would have held power on the ground, maintaining the Roman lifestyle and viewing the Roman emperor as their sovereign. So the Gothic king and his retainers would have been middlemen who might have had estates of their own, but which wouldn't supplant the previous aristocracy. Just throwing my own 2 cents in here. It seems like this would have been correct, at least in the beginning stages, but I'm questioning the extent to which there would have been this very sharp split between the Roman nobility and the Visigoths. It seems to me like with time, these Germanic federati who had been granted kingdoms would have assimilated into a Romanitas.
I think it's absolutely correct. And I think the Visigoths are a great example of that, because from what I understand, the Visigoths in Spain especially would pretty quickly lose knowledge of the Gothic language and become speakers of the vulgar dialects that would become Spanish.
And I mean, that you also see that in, say, Burgundy, right? Which is also part of France, right? So they very quickly became more Latinized, Romanized as well. Even though they did consider themselves Visigothic even up to the time of Clovis, right? Because Clotilda, his wife, was a Burgundian, but they had adopted the language and adopted a lot of Roman traits. So you can see parallels.
Yeah, and then you're like, that's a great example, because the Burgundians supposedly claim heritage from the island of Bornholm in Scandinavia, where they believe their ancestors came from. But if you go to Burgundy today, there's a lot more French wine and a lot less Danish rye bread these days up there.
Yeah, and this is part of a much larger trend, which we saw all the way back when there was still a Roman Republic and not an empire, where basically you had, the Romans would differentiate between the Gauls, who would have lived near the Roman borders. So these people, they would have spoken some Latin. Their tastes would overlap with Romans. Whereas further afield, where Julius Caesar would have been waging his Gallic wars, those people were just total barbarians.
Well, yeah, because there were varying levels of Romanization that seemed to correspond pretty well with how incorporated a group was in Roman society. We mentioned those one-off mercenaries who would have been from Denmark and Norway. You could assume they were probably much less Romanized than the Franks, who in turn would probably have been a lot less Romanized than the Visigoths, just because they had increasingly more connections with Roman authority. But I guess one group of barbarians which probably had the least links with Roman culture, who are personally my favorite group of barbarians at this time, who you mentioned already, Natasha, who I think we should do an entire episode on sometime soon, because they're just so fun, are the Huns.
Yeah, so let's get down to business to discuss the Huns.
The Huns, they were an empire on horseback, led famously by Attila. Quick question, do you guys know what the most common theory about the meaning of the name Attila is?
I do not.
It is a Gothic diminutive for little father. So, which implies that the Gothic speakers underneath his authority were like, yeah, he's our dad.
That's very cute.
The Huns probably have their ultimate origins among the Xiongnu in northeast China, who would have had a long, very belligerent relationship with the Han Empire in China. But across about a 200-year period, one branch of these Xiongnu descendants would have migrated westward, going into India and Central Asia, and eventually, ultimately, reaching the borders of the Roman Empire. They subjugated many of the barbarian peoples in Eastern Europe, including the Sarmatian descendants, like the Alans, who we'll mention again, as well as a lot of Gothic peoples. Probably the most important direct connection between, or at least direct bit of contact between the Huns and the Romans themselves comes in the province of Gaul. When in 451, there was this famous battle of the Catalonian Plains, where the Romans defeated the Huns, which traditionally was seen by a lot of European historians as this turning point in civilization, where, this like Asiatic Oriental horde was defeated by Western civilizing power.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that's how the Romans saw it.
We should mention, though, that at the time, both armies, both on the Roman side and on the Hunnic side of this battle, would have largely been made up of various Germanic barbarians, which is kind of funny. So even though we understand this as, the Western Christian Romans versus the pagan Asian, these almost subhuman barbarians, the two armies themselves probably wouldn't have looked that much different. You probably saw a lot more horsemen on the Hun side, and you probably would have seen some, more Asian descended people leading the ranks on the Hun side and more Italian descended people leading the ranks on the Roman side. In practice, this was a very messy kind of period where both forces were leaning heavily on mercenaries and tribal auxiliaries.
Yeah, and maybe to go back to the Huns for a little bit, as Guillaume mentioned, the traditional view had been that they started out basically in northeastern China, and over hundreds of years they made their way west. Whereas now some of the scholarship seems to suggest that rather this being a cohesive group of people that would have made their way west, it seems like Hun in and of itself became a recruiting tool, a branding exercise, just like these unrelated peoples attaching themselves to the Hun name to say, hey, look, we're the Huns, we're the big baddies that defeated China. Let's go and raid some more, fellas.
Yeah. In that case, we could talk about this in a future episode, but we're going to mention a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne's empire in this episode, which presented itself as the inheritors of the Roman legacy without actually being directly descended from the Western Roman Empire. There might have been a similar situation with the Xiongnu of China and the Huns in Central Asia and West and Eastern Europe. In any case, we should also mention that there were Frankish troops on both sides of this battle. So, Clovis, who we're going to talk about, might have had some cousins who fought for the Huns, which is kind of fun. In any case, the Huns would not have as much direct impact on European history, I would argue, as groups like the Franks and the Visigoths, except maybe being the ancestors of the Bulgars who founded Bulgaria, and intriguingly, maybe even also the ZK people of Hungary. It's kind of funny because for centuries, the ZKs have had this mythology of being descended from the Huns, and Western Europeans always assumed it was BS. But some genetic research very recently suggests that actually there might actually be something there. But in any case, I think that it's fair to say that the main impact the Huns had was indirect, because the Huns were so powerful east of the Roman Empire that they forced many groups east of the Roman Empire, such as the Goths and the Alans, into Western Europe, which meant that both of those groups, the Visigoths and the Alans, would end up settling in Gaul alongside the Franks. We should mention that as this period of chaos progressed across the 5th century, eventually it would reach its height when another Germanic general named Odoacer famously deposed the child emperor Romulus, declaring himself king of Italy. This time, it does seem to have been a more decisive political move than something like Alaric calling himself king of the Visigoths. Because this time, if there's no more Roman emperor in the West, it's much harder to say that there's a Roman Empire in the West. It gets a little bit more complicated because Odoacer still respected the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno as his sovereign, which is interesting, but on the ground, Odoacer's deposition of the child emperor pretty much ended the Western Roman Empire and traditionally marks the fall of Rome in the Western European imagination. This meant that, in some ways, it was really just a spiritual political change, because so much of the power in Gaul was already held by local barbarian forces. But in any case, this really ended the fiction of lasting Roman authority in Western Europe, because except for a few little pockets of Roman troop holdouts, after Odoacer makes this decision, suddenly the curtain is pulled away and Western Europe is revealed as this patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, which will, in many cases, remain in place well into the Middle Ages. So Rome has fallen in the West, leaving behind a very upset, angry, petty nobility of Roman citizens who are now ruled over not by an emperor, but simply by those barbarian middlemen. It's a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms across the empire. And Gaul is the best example of this. because at this time, there was not a single kingdom in Gaul. There were, God, like 7 or 8. Could you tell us, what was the landscape of post-Roman Gaul in the 5th century?
So basically, there's southwestern Gaul, Aquitaine, which was dominated by the Visigoths, who were a federati kingdom centered around Toulouse. And then there's north central Gaul, where this contingent of the Roman military continued asserting the authority of the empire for 10 years after the empire in the west dissolved, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so think the territory of modern-day Normandy.
Yeah, centered around the city of Soissons, near Paris.
Yeah, including Soissons. Yeah, it's usually called the Kingdom of Soissons, or the Kingdom of the Romans. And it actually went as far as Paris. And so I believe would have a pretty important, this region would have a very important legacy long term. What's kind of interesting is that it was led by a guy named Syagrius, just some Roman general who never, threw in the towel. And just like Odoacer, he claimed to be working for the empire in the east, but didn't seem to actually have any contact with Constantinople.
This wouldn't have been the highest thing in Constantinople's priorities. Not even close.
But of course the Visigoths and the Romans would only be a small part of the people in Gaul at this time.
Yeah, there's so much more. Fuck, there's in the northwest, you got these settlers who are fleeing the Anglo-Saxon invasions and had just begun settling up this new Celtic kingdom, Brittany.
And the name for Brittany actually comes from, the island of Britain. It was named that because it's where people from Britain ended up settling and preserving the Celtic language. Some
of our listeners might not realize that the Breton language, it's a Celtic language, but it's not descended from Gaulish. The Gaulish language is completely extinct. It's in fact, I believe, the most widely spoken Brittonic language, even more than Welsh. And it's very closely related to Welsh.
Then you got along the Loire River, you got the Scythian Alans.
Yeah, we have the Sarmatian queen with us right now. If you want to share anything about the Alans before we go on.
Actually, I don't know that much about the Alans as much as others, but I mean, I knew that they were mostly around Orleans and Valence, right?
Yeah. They were sort of in between the Roman territory, the Roman holdout state, and the Bretons.
And I know that they did influence the Ossetian language.
Yeah, in the Caucasus, it's descended. Yeah,
and even the Pashtuns. That's another language descended from them.
Yeah, well, Alan is it's Aryan.
Yeah, the name comes from because the real Aryans. Obviously, it means people from India and Iran, because they had an ultimate Iranian origin. Although their language would have been closer to Persian than anything else, they would have had a culture very recognizable to the Huns.
And it was also contemporaneous.
Totally, yeah. And just rounding off the landscape of Gaul here, in the southeast, you had the Burgundians we mentioned before. There's one Burgundian named Clotilda. This one princess would be very important. We'll talk about her in a second. And then in the northeast of Gaul, you had the Frankish kingdom, Austrasia, which is centered around that town Tournai, where the king Chilperic was buried.
It's in Belgium today.
Yeah, in Belgium. Yeah, we should mention that the name Austrasia comes from Österreich, Eastern Kingdom, which is the same origin of Austria. Kind of funny. So there's a million kingdoms in Gaul here. But obviously, Gaul today is not known as Alania, and it's not all called Brittany. It's not called Roman land, and it's not called Burgundy. Gaul today is known as France. And the reason for that is incredibly simple. It was the Franks who would unite all of Gaul very quickly under their power. And from the scant sources we have, especially the Gallo-Roman writer Gregory of Tours, really one monarch in particular was foundational in cementing Frankish power.
Clovis!
That's right. Yeah, Clovis. Speaking of archaeogenetics, his name today might come to mind because just like how the Franks named towns everywhere, there's a lot of towns named after Clovis, including towns in the American Southwest, where the earliest known at the time Native American remains were discovered. So sidebar there. But Clovis himself, he was not a Native American person from 10,000 years ago. He was a Frankish person from 2,000 years ago. And that he was the son of Chilperic, we mentioned, the bee guy. And his name, actually, Clovis, corresponds with the French name Louis, or Louis. So how every French king in the Middle Ages up until the Revolution was named Louis? You can sort of see Clovis as Louis Zero. He wasn't the first Louis he wasn't really the king of France, but they all sort of come from him. And from what we can tell from the writings of Gregory of Tours is that pretty much as soon as Clovis ascended to the throne of Austrasia, he almost immediately went west and conquered that last rump state, the Kingdom of the Romans, around Soissons, near Paris. They would call the area that the Romans formerly ruled Neustria, which probably meant New Kingdom. And this area, actually, we should mention, would become the seat of Frankish power for a very long time. And then after the time of Charlemagne, when the Western Frankish Empire became France, this region would remain, up until the present, the main political and economic center of France. The area around Soissons, Orléans, and Paris, Neustria. Probably the most important thing about this part of Clovis's conquest was that the story of the Vase of Soissons, which some of our listeners might know. All right, so please, Sam B, tell us the story of the Vase of Soissons.
The army had taken from a certain church a vase of a wonderful size and beauty, along with the remainder of the utensils for the service of the church. And the bishop of the church sent messengers to the king, asking what the vase be returned. On hearing this, the king said to the messenger, "Follow us as far as Soissons. All that has been taken is to be divided there, and when Allah assigns me that dish, I will do what the Father asks." And then when he came to Soissons, and all the booty was in their midst, the king said, "I ask you, brave warriors, not to refuse to grant me in addition to my share yonder dish." When they said this, a foolish, envious, and excitable fellow lifted his battle axe and struck the vase, and he cried in a loud voice, "You shall get me at nothing here except when Allah fairly bestows on you." At this, all were stupefied, but the king endured the insult with the gentleness of patience, and taking the vase, he handed it over to the messengers of the church, nursing the wounds deep in his heart.
But of course, Clovis would not forget this slight.
At the end of the year, he ordered the whole army to come with their equipment of armor, to show the brightness of his arms on the field of march. And when he was reviewing them all carefully, he came to the man who struck the vase, and he said to him, "No one has brought me armor so carelessly kept as you, for neither your spear nor your sword nor your axe is in serviceable condition." And seizing his axe, he cast it onto the earth. And when the other had bent to pick it up, the king raised his hands and drove his axe down into the man's head. "This," he said, "is what you did at Soissons to the vase."
So that's the kind of famous story about Clovis that every French kid learns in school. It's like George Washington and the cherry tree. It's this myth, probably not actually true, but it's used to tell us a lot about the character of this person. And I think in particular, what it says about the character of Clovis is that he was this very ruthless barbarian king, but he was also respectful of Christian authority, which is what separates the Franks in the medieval historical memory from basically any other barbarian people at this time.
Yeah, but the Gregory of Tours is, of course, an ecclesiastical source, and these people had a tendency to exaggerate the importance of the church, especially when it came to the early periods. So while Clovis himself did seem to become a Christian at some point, it would have been significantly after this event had taken place.
Yeah. Oh, we'll get to that in a second, yeah. But I think that what this story tells us, though, that the fact that this story is remembered, I think, tells us a lot about how the later Christian Franks understood themselves and their own recent ancestors essentially as noble savages, as barbarians just like the Alans and the Huns and the Visigoths, but who happened to be a little more enlightened, supposedly, than those other people. What's funny, though, is that what the historian Philip Dayleader has mentioned is that even though the Franks are more closely associated with the political legacy of Rome, especially because of the church, than other groups, the Visigoths were a lot more Romanized culturally. But unlike the Franks, the Visigoths made one really big mistake that hurts their reputation in history.
Well, they chose Arianism. However, I don't know if I would frame it so much as a mistake. They just ended up on the losing side of history in this case.
Yeah, that's a much better way to put it. There at the time, there were two competing branches of Christianity. Arianism was this, the other Christians called it a heresy, that was very popular among Germanic-speaking barbarians. And really just by chance, it seems like, when Clovis converted, his wife happened to be one of the only Catholics around in the barbarian world. And so his wife, Clotilda, convinced him to join the Roman tradition of Catholic, or at the time, Chalcedonian Christianity, which was very rare in Western Europe. Non-Roman people didn't really seem to be Catholic very often. You could argue that Clovis's decision to convert to Catholic Christianity and not Arianism was one of the most, significant decisions he would make on the history of later Western Europe and France. Russian Sam, could you read this quote about how Clotilda convinced Clovis to convert?
So we have this by way of Gregory of Tours, who again wrote the history of the Franks.
Yeah, same guy from the Soissons story.
He had a firstborn son by Queen Clotilda, and his wife wished to consecrate the child in baptism. She tried to persuade her husband, saying, quote, "The gods you worship are nothing, and they will be unable to help themselves as anyone else, for they are graven out of stone or wood or some metal. Saturn, who fled in fear of being banished from his kingdom by a son. Jove himself, the foul perpetrator of all shameful crimes, not able to refrain from intercourse with his own sister. What could Mars or Mercury do for you? They are endowed rather with the magic arts rather than with the power of the divine name. You ought rather worship he who created by his word heaven and earth. The sea and all that in them is out of a state of nothingness, who made the sun shine, and adorned the heavens with stars, who filled the waters with creeping things, the earth with living things, and the air with creatures that fly, by whose hand mankind was created, by whose generosity all that creation serves and helps men whom he created as his own."
Yeah, nice words there. Yeah. So, maybe that's, how the conversion went down. Some people think he might have just wanted a blessing for his battles against the Visigoths, who he would pretty soon afterwards also conquer. One thing I like a lot is that from much later saints' lives written like in the High Middle Ages, there's a pretty well circulated story that after telling Clovis about Jesus, Clotilda convinced Clovis to meet with some monks who would give him some, Bible study lessons. And according to these stories, is that when the monks got to the part about the crucifixion and how Jesus was, so terribly treated by the Romans, Clovis jumped out of his chair and said, "If I was there with my Franks, we would have avenged Jesus right there." Yeah, a little bit of a Mark Wahlberg in the Franks.
Someone would have had to hold him back.
Yeah. We'll see. So we should mention now. So it is really unusual that the Franks became Catholic rather than Arian, especially because all other peoples around them, including Clotilda's family, were Arians. I'm wondering, Natasha, do you think that Clotilda simply just had some aesthetic or spiritual preference for the Roman brand of Christianity, or was it a political consideration? Why do you think Clotilda and Clovis chose to become Chalcedonian Catholic Christians rather than Arian Christians?
So it's really interesting because, like you said, her family was not Catholic. They were Arians. They were Burgundians. They were Visigoths, and they were Arian. So we don't really know why Clotilda became Catholic. She clearly converted at some point. And it's not clear if that was before or after she married Clovis either. But so she was extremely a rarity. Absolutely. And so a little add-on to the story about the son. So actually, she did secretly baptize her firstborn son, according to the story. And that son did die. And there's a story that Clovis was so angry and he was yelling and, you cursed him, actually, that sort of thing. And then she had a second son who she did baptize, and he also got sick, but that time he lived. And so she used that to show, see, the blessing worked this time. Not sure how convincing that is, 50% success rate. But additionally, I think, having a Catholic wife is a push factor, but I think there was a lot of political reasons to become Catholic over Arian. Right, so the Franks are the last big pagan group, in that area, in Gaul, I should say, not in the rest of the North Sea, is what I was trying to say. Definitely in Gaul, and he was surrounded by Visigoths, by Arians, and he wanted to expand. Right, he had just reunited the Salian and the Ripuarian Franks to become the king of all Franks, and by choosing the different language, by being able to create bonds to Rome, it was a political choice that he made, and it was a very successful political choice. Even though he died just a couple years later, his sons and grandsons were able to use this connection to grow power, and eventually they beat back the Visigoths and they beat back Arianism, and Catholicism became dominant. But it very easily could have gone the other way, and, the dominant strain of Christianity would have been Arianism. Whether that would be better is not on the topic of this podcast, but...
Arianism, that we could do a whole episode on that, too. It's such a very interesting topic. One kind of pet theory I have about why the Franks became Catholic is that if the Franks were less Romanized than the Visigoths and the Bretons, which I think was probably the case, I'm wondering if they might have thought that adopting Roman Christianity might have been necessary to ally themselves with these more Romanized nobility beneath them. because they had to cooperate with the Gallo-Roman nobility because they were the ones who, ran all the farms and would have been responsible for collecting and paying the taxes. So that's kind of my pet theory.
Well, the Visigoths would have had to do that too, and they still became Aryan.
Well, I'm wondering if it's because the Visigoths were just much more Roman in their culture that the Gallo-Romans were more likely to want to work with them. But who knows? Unless we have a time machine, we can't really figure this out. I wish we did have a time machine because then we could actually learn something about what the previous pagan religion of the Franks had been. Like, you mentioned that the Franks were the last pagans around, Natasha, but what's interesting is that we really don't know much about their paganism. It probably looked a lot like the paganism of the Anglo-Saxons and the Continental Saxons and the Norse, but it's really hard to know. And that what might have, seemed kind of funny to our listeners is that in that Gregory of Tours story, when he mentions the Frankish gods, he calls them Jove and Mercury. Instead of actually assigning them Germanic names, either he doesn't realize that they did not worship the Greco-Roman pantheon, or he just wanted to replace the names of Germanic gods with more familiar Roman gods that his readers would know. We really only have one hint of Frankish mythology that comes from the name of the primary ruling dynasty of the Franks at this time, which was the Merovingians, who themselves have a very interesting mythical origin story that sort of parallels the mythical origins of other Germanic-speaking peoples, but it's a little bit different. If you wouldn't mind telling this story, Natasha.
So yes, this comes from Fredegar, who is the only surviving Frankish historian from this period that we still have. And we don't have much, and it's not fully translated to English, but we do have this fragment. It is said that while Clodio was staying at the seaside with his wife one summer, his wife went into the sea at midday to bathe, and a beast of Neptune, rather like a quinatar, found her. In the event, she was made pregnant, either by the beast or her husband, and she gave birth to a son called Merovec, from whom the kings of the Franks have subsequently been called Merovingians. So, I love that it leaves it ambiguous. It could have been Clodio, but it also could have been the Quinatar, which is a bull head and front half of the body, and then a fish sea creature tail. So like a common image from mythology.
Yeah.
Curved curly horns, I believe.
This sounds like a case for Jerry Springer to get to the bottom of.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I wonder if it's some kind of like weird, like ancient plausible deniability. Like whoever came up with that story, some, like 4th century Frank guy, he wanted to claim descent from some ancient king called Clodio, but also wanted to claim descent from the gods. So this is his way. He's like, oh, I don't know. My great grandpa might have been, the son of this bull monster, or maybe not. It's hard to tell.
It reminds me of how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims that the Saxons are descended from Odin.
But this is a little more flamboyant.
It's more indirect. So instead of being descended from Woden, which the Franks probably believed in as a Germanic group, they instead are descended from a beast of Neptune, and I'm forgetting what the ocean god was in Germanic.
I don't think the Norse had a clear ocean god, as far as I know.
Oh, it's Ron. It was a woman. She was an Aegir, and she was married to a Jotun.
Oh, great, yeah. They love doing that, those Norse gods. They love marrying giants.
But again, they're using the word Neptune instead of the name of the actual god, because obviously there is a parallel between the Frankish sea god and the Greco-Roman one.
Right. And again, we talked about before, it's like we don't know if this is a genuinely ancient, many thousands of years old Indo-European connection going all the way back to the ancient Neolithic ancestors of these cultures, or if it's just there was contact across the Germanic-speaking and Latin-speaking world, and religious ideas, just like those Roman gladiuses and Roman-style helmets, passed back and forth. It's hard to know. One other legacy about Clovis we should mention, which is maybe almost as important as his conversion, is the fact that during Clovis's time, traditional Frankish customs of justice and inheritance were codified into a Roman-style legal book, which was the Book of Salic Law, which the name comes after the place in the Netherlands that the Austrasian Franks had come from, an area called Sala. The Salic Law looks a lot like the other Germanic legal systems we know about from Anglo-Saxon England, for instance. So most penalties were monetary. If you killed someone, that's fine. You just pay a fine. One really interesting thing about Salic law, which is probably its most famous aspect, is its insistence on male inheritance over women. There were a lot of different inheritance systems across Europe at this time. If we look at the Norse sagas, it seems like the Vikings didn't really have much of a problem with daughters inheriting property, but the Franks sure did. And I think that you were mentioning earlier, Natasha, that a lot of the dynastic issues that would plague European royalty for generations after, for centuries after this, all have their roots in this Merovingian legal code.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the kingdoms didn't even like to let grandsons inherit if their mother had been the daughter of a king, right? That was how absolute they took it. And even though England didn't follow Salic law exactly, they were influenced, and very early on, the Empress Matilda, you might be familiar with, they did not want to let her inherit, even though they didn't explicitly follow Salic law, and within the English code, it would have been legal, but the influence was so strong, especially because they were so French. Yeah, they were so French.
Yeah, listen to last month's episode on the Lion of Winter if you want to know more about those guys.
Yes, yeah, they were so French influenced, since they were Norman at the time, that even though their own laws of their country did not follow Salic law, they were influenced.
Yeah, and speaking of following Salic law, it should be kept in mind that Salic law seems to have been meant specifically for the Salic tribe within the larger Frankish confederation, rather than the Franks writ large.
Yeah, it ended up applying to Germany, France, Italy.
Yeah. And, one more last point about Salic law, which would be very important later, so don't forget about this one, is that there is this preference for partitioning property among all sons instead of a single son inheriting land, which would become a very big problem for the Franks moving forward. We talked about the French influence on England at this time through the Normans and French culture in general. I think that's the best time now, then, to really bring us to a major part of this episode, which is how did the Franks, a Northern European, Germanic-speaking barbarian people, become the French, a Romance-speaking Western European, even Mediterranean people in some parts of France, whose culture really does not look much like other cultures of Northern Europe at all anymore, because it's so closely associated with the cultures of Southern Europe and the other Romance countries. I think one thing that we should mention here is that, just to start off, that might make this a little bit more easier to understand, is that although the Franks certainly had a common origin with other Germanic-speaking peoples, like the Angles and Saxons, and eventually, going farther back, with the Ostrogoths and Visigoths, there doesn't seem to have been any understanding of a common Germanic identity at this time, especially not between Franks and Goths, who would have been much more diverged than other groups in that area. A lot of Romantic nationalists in the 18th and 19th century, and then the racial nationalists of the 20th century, liked to use ancient Germanic political and ethnic groups as interchangeable. That the actions of the Franks in the 5th century, or the actions of the ancient Germani in the 1st century, or even the 10th century Vikings, could be seen as part of a continuous and unified Germanic civilization, and that modern-day peoples living in Germany or even France could claim to be part of this legacy. And oftentimes, almost always, this was connected to ideals of superiority. Even leaving aside the ethical, moral implications of that kind of ethno-nationalist worldview, it doesn't really seem to bear fruit that these various Germanic-speaking peoples seem to identify themselves with each other at all. Even though it seems very obvious to us that the Goths, the Saxons, the Franks, the Danes, all were similar groups speaking similar languages with similar religions, it does not appear through the historical record that these groups themselves, or even peoples observing those groups in the Greek and Roman world, saw them as connected, which is a really interesting paradox. Their languages are undoubtedly related, and they have many cultural traits in common, yet those similarities were very rarely, if ever, remarked upon by contemporary writers.
Well, it's the narcissism of small differences, frankly. There's no other explanation for it.
Maybe, but keep in mind that when Roman writers were talking about various barbarian peoples, they would always lump the Goths with the Scythians, who spoke a totally different language. And whereas they would oftentimes lump together the Franks with the previous Celtic-speaking Gauls. It seems like region had a bigger influence on Roman understandings of culture and ethnicity than language did. Another big thing, I think, is that we can also see that there were a lot of very big cultural divisions within different groups. As we mentioned, that Gothic speakers were both very big participants in the Roman Empire, as well as a major part of the empire of Attila the Hun. And that it's most likely that Eastern Gothic speakers in modern-day Ukraine under Hunnic rule probably had a very different lifestyle from the Western Goths living in Sicily and Gaul under Roman rule. And one thing that I think is super cool is that we even see Gothic burials where they had heads. They would have infants' heads tied up to make them longer, which was the Hunnic style that spread among the Goths. So yeah, that's just kind of an example there about how there could have still been these big cultural divisions within these broad umbrellas like Goth or Frank. One thing that's kind of funny about the Franks also is that Fredegar, who we mentioned before, in his chronicle, when he's giving this sort of mythological history of the Franks, he doesn't link them with other Germanic peoples at all. Instead, he insists that the Franks are descended from the Trojans, just like the Romans believed. And what's also funny about Fredegar is that he believed that one other group in the world was also descended from the Trojans, which were the Turks, which is funny. So he's saying he believed that the Turks, the Romans, and the Franks were all brothers somehow.
We are all Turks.
This is probably the first instance of the Trojans being described as Turks, which would become a very big part of modern Turkish culture centuries later, which is funny to think about. And then turn back one last time to our friend Guy Halsell. One thing he also mentions that he finds revealing is that, again, the Goths and the Franks would have spoken related languages that probably would have seemed related to onlookers. By the time of Clovis, they'd probably only been diverged for about 500 or 600 years. So they probably should have still been, if not intelligible, recognizably similar. But what's interesting is that it isn't until the Carolingian period, centuries after Clovis, that you have any recognition in paper of the fact that Gothic and Frankish languages are related, which is very interesting to me. That it seems like even though you'd think that this kind of similarity would be obvious, it doesn't seem to have been especially obvious, or at least especially relevant to medieval people. And I'm wondering, Natasha, what do you think that all of this has to say about the ways that medieval cultures, including the Franks themselves, understood identity?
Well, I think that we keep coming back to a through line of how the Franks, as they were coming to power independent of the Romans, were trying to solidify connections to the Romans as some sort of appeal to the elite, right? So Fredegar saying that they also came from Troy is an example of that. So I think that was a big deal to them to present themselves as an inheritor to the Roman Empire in Gaul in that sense, even though they really did not have that many connections. But otherwise, I mean, I think in the modern day, we think about language and linguistics a lot, and that's a relatively new thing, right? So when you think about an ancient people, you have no idea that languages are related. They might seem similar. They might seem like, oh, well, I can understand the Goths a little bit, but they're so different from me, right? You would not think like, oh, we must be related just based on language. If you have no concept of that, then you wouldn't think that unless you're like some, very smart, insightful thinker who proposes such an idea. But the average person will not think that because that's just not how it's thought of. So I think that's a big part of it, right? So it's like, okay, sure, I'm a Frank and I can understand Goths most of the time, but we are so different. There's no way that we're related, right? It's way more important, the other connections, than language.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of brings us to the sort of last leg of this episode, which is the culture of the Gallo-Romans, which the Franks would try to emulate. And I think emulate so successfully that eventually the Franks themselves would basically cease to exist. They would be dissolved into the broader Romance-speaking population. So this population obviously was the vast majority of the population of Gaul at this time. There might have still been some Celtic-speaking peoples left, but they probably would have been pretty isolated, and that the most common language, especially among the elite, was Latin. And we know that as soon as the Goths got there, even before the fall of Rome, a lot of these Gallo-Roman writers were not too happy about suddenly having to pay taxes to a Frankish king instead of a Roman governor. And there's a pretty funny quote here by a guy named Sidonius. I believe he was a churchman who left a huge cache of letters from the 5th century.
How can I write when I am placed among long-haired hordes, having to endure Germanic speech, praising often with a wry face the song of the gluttonous Burgundian who spreads rancid butter on his hair? You don't have a reek of garlic and foul onions discharged upon you at early morn from 10 breakfasts, and you are not invaded before dawn by a crowd of giants. Wow, 10 breakfasts. That sounds very exciting, very lively. It seems like they had a very active brunch culture.
I too do not like enduring Germanic speech.
And yet you speak English. Curious.
I know. Oh, I'm a self-hating Jew.
The Gallo-Roman nobility, although they do seem to have resented the new Germanic middlemen to some extent, they also realized that connecting with these guys was the best way that they could move up socially. And the Gallo-Roman nobility was always interested in social mobility. So right from the start, there was a very large degree of intermarriage between Roman families and Frankish families. Talking about the Franks themselves, although they did very quickly exert a lot of power over Gaul, tragically for the Merovingians, they wouldn't keep that power for long. The Merovingians themselves are really only famous for two things. First, having long hair, and second, being really bad at being kings.
Yeah, man, listen, if I were Clovis, I could have conquered so much more territory than he did. Listen, he was a total amateur. He didn't know what he was doing, okay?
I would say, Russian Sam, I think that conquering territory for these guys is the easy part. The hard part is keeping their authority. Because what happened with the Merovingians is that slowly, in the century and a half after Clovis, all of the real authority of the Frankish kingdom became held by a person known as the mayor of the palace, who ran all of the logistics of the military and also dealt with all of the economic relations between the king, between the tribal nobles, and the Gallo-Roman aristocracy. Really important guy, this mayor. By the 7th century, a family that would eventually be called the Carolingians monopolized this position. Whenever a boy king, like a child, would be in power, they would slowly accumulate more authority for themselves, because the boy king couldn't handle it themselves. And then when the boy king came of age, they wouldn't give it back.
So the Carolingians kept the Merovingians around as sort of puppet kings rather than taking power directly.
Exactly. So for about a century, more than a century, that was the situation where the Carolingian family was probably the most powerful family in Gaul, more powerful than the royal family, but they kept this pretense up of the Merovingian kings being in charge. Eventually that would change in the year 732 with one very ambitious mayor of the palace named Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, who gained notoriety for his successful military encounter with a group of Muslim Moors in the famous Battle of Tours. And so just like the Battle of Catalonian Fields, earlier generations of historians insisted that this battle would have been some major, victory for Western civilization and Christendom, whatever that entails. But personally, I think that seems a little bit unlikely. It seems that there actually were other Muslim holdings in France that would stay for a very long time. So this battle doesn't seem to have really been decisive at all. I think really it's just that it was a good story for people like Charles Martel to tell. And then eventually the story would be very widely circulated because all of the ensuing rulers of France for the next couple centuries would be themselves descendants of this guy, Charles Martel. So it makes sense to really embellish his record in the history books. And as soon as Charles Martel has this victory against the Muslims, he decides, if I'm this great military ruler and my family is so important and we have so much power in Gaul, maybe we shouldn't just be the mayors of the palace for the Frankish kingdom. Maybe we should be the kings ourselves. So Charles launched a plan to place his sons on the throne. And it would take a while for him to pull it off, and he would die before he could see it through. But eventually, it would work, and the Carolingians would become the kings of the Franks. But they had an ally that made this a lot easier for them. That ally, interestingly, was the Pope. What's really so, again, we talked about the fact that the Franks were Catholic. What's important to note, though, is that in the 7th century, they would have basically been the only Catholics in Western Europe. There were Catholics in England, and there were sort of Catholics in Ireland who were kind of autonomous. But really the only kingdom with close relations with the papacy were the Franks. And what was especially depressing for the papacy was the fact that the rulers of the rest of Italy at this time were some of the most loathsome Arians around from the perspective of Catholic sectarians. These guys were the Lombards, from whom, the Italian province of Lombardy gets their name. Just like the Franks, the Lombards were a Germanic-speaking barbarian tribe, but they do seem to have been even more barbarian than the Franks themselves. Infamously, their kings would drink wine out of skulls, and they probably were still pagan when they came to Italy. And when they eventually adopted Christianity, it wasn't Catholicism of the Pope, it was, again, Arianism. So the fact that the Arians were breathing down the Pope's neck meant that he had a really strong reason for wanting an ally. Because the Franks seemed to be the foremost Catholic power, it would make sense to ally with them. But the Frankish kingdom, as we said, was pretty weak. So I think that the Pope might have realized here that if he could help the Carolingian family become kings of the Franks, then his ally, the Franks, could become a lot stronger, and he could get something in return. So there was a permanent alliance between the Merovingian kings and the papacy. And in exchange for this protection, Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, was eventually given papal sanction to pull off a palace coup. You want to read this story? It's kind of interesting.
Pepin summoned all the major Frankish nobles to the palace and had them elect him as the new king. He also had a powerful army waiting outside the palace in case they made the wrong call. And the last Merovingian king, Childeric, was cast out of the palace. And according to legend, he had his long royal hair forcibly cut short and spent the rest of his life confined to a monastery. And then shortly afterward, Pope Stephen traveled across the Alps to Soissons, where he anointed Pepin as king and patrician of the Romans. The ceremony and the title were both without precedent in Western Europe.
So really, this cements this very long-lasting relationship between the popes and the kings of France, where all the time the Franks would do something in aid to the popes, and the popes would give them increasingly fancy titles. Pepin's son, Charles the Great, or you might know him as Charlemagne, would really go far and beyond his dad Pepin by not only being proclaimed as king by the Pope, but also emperor on Christmas Day 800. So for the first time in more than 300 years, in Charlemagne's time, there were 2 Roman emperors. Charlemagne is a huge topic that we don't really have time to get into in this episode. We can in the future, but really much more than the Merovingians, Charlemagne and the Carolingians would expand Frankish authority all across Western Europe, including much of Italy and parts of Spain, and pressing very deep into Germany, including many places that had never been subject to Roman authority centuries before. So really, it was this moment with Charlemagne's coronation that would have a very strong effect on the spread of Frankish power, as well as the spread of Christianity across the last remaining pagans of continental Europe, at least in the West. We mentioned, though, we talked about Salic law. There was one little problem with Salic law that would come back to bite Charlemagne.
The division between sons, sorry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it was that. Charlemagne's empire was inherited by one son, Louis the Pious, but that son had 3 sons. So guess what happens?
It gets partitioned.
Exactly. So you have, in the east, you have East Francia, which would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire, when the German speakers would briefly have a closer relationship with the Pope than the French speakers would. In the middle, you have Lotharingia, which would be this territory traded back and forth between German and French speakers for basically 1,000 years. And then in the west, you would have West Francia, or France, which would become really which would evolve pretty rapidly into the modern state of France. Unlike the rest of Frankish territory, West Francia spoke Old French rather than Frankish.
Which was a Romance language, obviously.
Yeah, it's a Romance language, and there really is this continuous Roman legacy up to the present that you don't see in other parts of the Carolingian world. So the Western Frankish territory would very naturally become the Kingdom of France. And what's very interesting about France is that, unlike basically everywhere else in Europe, it would be continuously ruled by native Old French-speaking nobility for basically all of its history. So if you're wondering why French people are like that, maybe it's because they never got taken down a peg by enough foreign invaders like the British did. But in any case, the reason why French culture really exists at all is because, as we've been talking about this whole episode, the cultures of the Frankish nobility would merge with the cultures of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy. So you've got these two traditions coming together: this pagan barbarian Germanic-speaking tradition and a Roman Catholic Latin-speaking tradition. And it really seems like the Romance traditions would win out, and that these days there is a lot more Romanized elements of French culture than Germanic.
Right. So by the time of the Carolingians, it wasn't really possible to distinguish between the descendants of the Germanic-speaking mercenary elite and the old stock Latin speakers. And many aspects of Roman culture would survive in the society, like the Catholic Church, for example. And other aspects, like the famous Roman triumph, would disappear. According to Henri Perrine, it was not until the Carolingian era that the old Roman cities lost their prominence, and a new set of cities, usually centered around a palace or a castle, would come to prominence in France.
We start to see increased power of the dukes and counts in this period as their local courts become increasingly important. Eventually, they would not only be economically important, but politically important. And so what we start to see across the Carolingian period is that just like the Merovingians before them, even the descendants of Charlemagne would get reduced to these do-nothing kings who are living at the mercy of their officers and nobles. Eventually, the last Carolingian in West Francia will die without issue as a young man, leaving it open. All the various Frankish noble families, who are now essentially French noble families in the 10th century, start vying for control. And there is one guy in particular who controls the areas of Neustria around Paris, named Hugh Capet, who would end up being elected Rex Francorum, and whose descendants would rule France right up until the Revolution.
So the interesting thing about Hugh Capet is that he was the first Frankish king to not be able to speak Frankish. So he only spoke Old French. So the other kings likely spoke both. It's not like they only spoke Frankish. But Hugh Capet, since he was a lower noble who became an upjump, he wasn't in. It's unlike the Carolingians, which they worked directly for the kings, so they had reason to know Frankish.
Right, and I guess the Carolingians, they would have had connections with modern-day Germany also, because there were Franks all over the place after Charlemagne.
Absolutely.
So you had to know Frankish if you wanted to talk to your cousins over in Saxony.
But when you're just a noble in Neustria, there's not so much of a need. And so, yeah, he was the first one. And that is kind of a symbolic loss of the last bit of Frankishness in Francia at this time. He marks the end of an era, I guess you could say, right? He's a transition to the new French era of France, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's really in that roughly 100-year period. From the 10th century to the 11th century, you start to see a lot of major cultural changes in Europe. For instance, you have the Normans coming into England.
And into France.
Yeah, in that period. You have a lot of Christianization happening in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. This is really kind of when you start to see what you can call the older, if you want to say it, the barbarian political order starts to transform into this more high medieval, more kind of feudal Catholic order across Europe. And a big part of that was Hugh Capet as a French speaker.
Yes, and the 10th century is kind of considered the official change from the early medieval to the mid-late medieval, right? The second.
Oh, yeah, the high Middle Ages, yeah.
Yes, the high Middle Ages, I guess you could call. Yes, exactly.
One thing that I'm talking about language now, I don't want to get into Charlemagne too much because I want to save that for another episode, but one interesting thing about Charlemagne is that he might have been a monolingual Frankish speaker. He might have spoken no French at all, because according to his own chronicler, a guy named Einhard, he was really bad at learning Latin, and that he couldn't speak Church Latin at all. He didn't understand it at all, which I have to wonder if that might imply that he didn't even speak the vulgar Latin that was turning into Old French. Because it seems like during the time of Charlemagne, or at least until the time of Charlemagne, Romance speakers themselves did not distinguish their own Latin from the Latin of the Church, even though by the time of Charlemagne, Old French already existed as a language that was no longer intelligible with Latin. It doesn't seem like the speakers realized this, because the change was too subtle for them to notice. It's like the whole thing with you can boil a frog slowly by just raising the temperature. You can slowly turn Latin into French, but nobody's going to notice at any one point that their language is no longer Latin.
And, it's very interesting that the idea that Charlemagne may not have even understood Church Latin, because he actually promoted Latin quite a bit by bringing Alcuin from York in Anglo-Saxon England, who was a Catholic. And so Alcuin created the Carolingian minuscule, which is a handwriting script, easy to read, easy to write.
That's how I believe that's where lowercase letters come from, right?
Yeah, lowercase. Yeah, absolutely. And that was, used basically up until the printing press. He is the head of the Carolingian Renaissance, right? Like, he promoted literacy. Well, I mean, church Latin literacy, right, amongst the people. And just a lot of the stuff we have, a lot of the documents that we have, both for the Franks and then also for Anglo-Saxon England, because all of his work in France trickled back over into England, is because of Charlemagne sponsoring him and really promoting him. So it's very interesting that Charlemagne might have been aware of his flaw here and found a way to promote it otherwise.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that it's really good you mention Alcuin, because according to Philip Dalliter, Alcuin himself played a really big role in the recognition that Old French had now become a language distinct from Latin, because he was an Anglo-Saxon. He didn't speak a Romance language natively, which meant that he was kind of a neutral observer. So then he learns perfect Church Latin in the schools of England. He goes to Charlemagne's court, hoping to speak Latin to the French, but then finds out that when he tries to say, like, quo vadis exitum or whatever, nobody knows what he's talking about because they no longer speak Latin. And he had no idea. And so this is the first time you see this recognition. And what's interesting also is that not only could he not understand the vulgar Latin that was becoming Old French, Alcuin had a really hard time with the classical Latin that was being written by these churchmen, because they often made mistakes influenced by their native Romance dialects.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And he wrote a lot of letters complaining about this.
And well, eventually, just to touch a little bit on the Carolingian Renaissance, is that another part of Charlemagne's legacy was that he would bring in all of these scholars, like we talked about. But the main reason why they started studying and bringing back these Roman texts was because they needed examples of good classical Latin from the classical era, because they were worried that none of them spoke Latin that was good enough. So we should talk about now, just to close off this episode, what was the Old French language that would emerge out of Latin in the early Middle Ages? How was it different from modern French, and what did it share with Frankish, the Germanic language? One thing that really sets apart Old French from other medieval Romance languages is the fact that it has a very strong influence of Germanic vocabulary.
A lot of vocabulary that came into Latin actually came by way of Germanic languages. And it's very unexpected things. Like, for example, north, south, east, west. I've mentioned this before. The cardinal directions, those are all Germanic words. And so consequently, a lot of this Germanic vocabulary that made its way into Latin and then later French also made its way into Italian and Spanish, other descendants of Latin.
In French in particular, the phonology, which French, as everyone knows, sounds a lot different from Spanish and Italian. Some people believe it's because it's basically Latin spoken with a Frankish Germanic accent, so that certain sounds were harder to make for the barbarian kings. So they were the kings. You can't tell them they're speaking bad Latin. Their Latin became the standard. Just in talking about Old French itself, in addition to this Germanic influence, it was also really different from modern French. And what I think is really just very wild that I've never seen really before in any language, I think Latin might have done this, and I think Lithuanian today still does this, but Old French also had a very complicated case system, much more so than today. And this case system, where nouns would be modified depending on how they were used in a sentence, was so significant that it even affected personal names, which is really interesting. Which means that when you're talking about a person in a sentence, the way you use their name in the sentence changes what their name is, which is really crazy to think about. The spelling and pronunciation of names would be affected by grammar. And what's really crazy is that this still is present in French names today. For example, every French name had 3 forms back then. You had the nominative form, which would be Carl, just C-A-R-L, or Charles it would become. And then you had other forms, like for for other cases, that would be Charles, Charles, or Char, also pronounced Charles, with an ES at the end, and Charlone, with an ON at the end. So if you were saying, if you were going to say Carl's mother, you wouldn't say la mère de Carl, you would say la mère Charlone, ending in the ON, which makes it possessive. And then if you were addressing him directly, you would add the ES and say Charles, which eventually would no longer be pronounced, which I think is really crazy. And it's like that's just so alien to modern languages. But I just think it's so cool that we still have that legacy of that in the spelling of these names. And some French names actually have different cases in the modern spelling. So Charles ends in the ES, but then Amon, A-M-O-N, ends in the O-N, just really kind of cool. Eventually, Old French itself would start to devolve into dialects, leading to the modern Oul and Oc dialects, Occitan versus Parisian French. We have one really great document of Old French from this time, which I know that you're familiar with, Natasha, the Oaths of Strasbourg. What exactly were those, just to finish us off with this episode, and why are they important?
So the Oaths of Strasbourg, so after Charlemagne died, right? So he split his kingdom, as we described, between his sons. So he had 3. So Charles the Bald, who was not bald, that's a different story. Louis the German, and Lothair, right? We talked about, right? So, Lothair was the successor of Louis the Pious, right? So, what happened was they went to war with each other. Who could have predicted this? So Charles the Bald, who was the king of West Francia, made a pact with Louis the German, who shockingly was the king of East Francia. And they took these oaths to each other and to the respective peoples to say that I will protect my brother who rules you, right? So Louis the German addressed the West Franks, the French, and Charles the Bald addressed the Germans. And so Charles the Bald wrote his oath in Frankish, and Louis the German wrote his oath in Old French. So we have the same text in both languages, and that's what makes it really special. And this is the first significant text in Old French that we have.
Yeah, so it's like a Rosetta Stone for early medieval languages, and that's just such a great little encapsulation of what the Frankish world looked like. It was still very Romanized, and arguably in some ways increasingly Romanized, but there were these lingering aspects of the Germanic legacy. It's just that increasingly you saw that France would be more uniformly Romance, and the German world would be more uniformly Germanized, especially in language. And this kind of just concludes that the Frankish world was just incredibly vast and would have such a wide-reaching influence, oftentimes in ways that you might not expect, especially because the Franks were so multilingual. The legacy had its effect among areas speaking many different languages today. Eventually, the French language itself would become second only to Latin in the courts of Europe as a result of the power of the Frankish nobility. And you would have, across the Middle Ages and the early modern period, you'd have royalty as far afield as Scotland and Russia learning French, oftentimes as a first language, because of its role as a language of nobility. And I just think in many ways, all of these contradictions of the early and ancient Franks sort of show us the contradictions of the Middle Ages as a whole. It's a society that's barbarian, but also Roman, that's ruled by these bloodthirsty conquerors who are also pious Christians. And that's why it's just so interesting to look at this one culture, which had such an important mark on history, but no longer really exists. And I just wanted to thank you again, Natasha, for being with us for such a fun episode. And it's been so long, too. You really lended so much time and expertise for this, and I'm really grateful for this. And I just wanted to kind of close this off here and ask, what do you think the map of Europe and the cultures of Europe would look like if the Franks had never expanded outside Austrasia? What would history be without the Franks?
I think you still would see Romance-speaking people in the area of France. I think it's a good question to whether or not it would have been united so quickly, right? So if you think more like Germany and Italy, lots of smaller states for a long time. So it's a really good question to know whether or not it would actually be reunited. But I think the big thought experiment is, what if Clovis had converted to Arianism? I think that one's more fun. But I think that's a big question. If you did not have this big early uniting of the country, would you have a united France throughout history? It's the same question Alfred the Great. If he had not pushed for England ruled by the English king, would you have seen England as a consolidated power, right? So I think these are really interesting questions. And who knows, it could have looked like the rest of Europe with much smaller polities, right? We have no idea. It's very possible. Right. So I think it's a good question on whether or not these groups, and especially we view these great men of history, right? Clovis and Charlemagne, especially considering the fact with the Franks, we're viewing it more in the sense that these great men of history made a really big effect considering there weren't that many actual Franks. Does the great man of history theory actually hold up more in this situation because of that? I mean, I think it's a great thought experiment in that case.
Yeah, no, I think it also shows that, whenever a structure of power collapses, which happens in the past and it's going to happen again, funny things happen, and groups that you don't expect to be holding things together ends up being the ones to do that.
I just remembered something. It was just something you said a little bit ago about how, France became this elite language around the world for nobles and royalty. But when you also think about the term lingua franca, this actually ties back right at the beginning of the episode. You were talking about how the term for Frank became a term for Westerner in many languages, right? So lingua franca never meant language like French. It meant language of the Franks in Latin, but it just became a colloquial term for the lingua franca, the pidgin that was used in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was actually
the Mediterranean lingua franca, Sabir or whatever.
Sabir, yes, exactly. It was Sabir, and it was Venetian, Genoese, but also some Catalan, and of course there were also Arabic and Turkic influences as well, but never really that much French. There were other Romance influences, but never really that much French. But it's, again, that term comes back up everywhere.
Yeah, because from the Greek and Arab perspective, a Frank wasn't just a person who spoke Frankish or even a person who spoke French. It was just anybody from Western Europe, the area that was under Frankish dominion.
Yeah, it's a very broad term. I mean, it even comes into names, the Frangia family in Lebanon, for example. I think that comes from...
Oh, wow, yeah. Oh, and the name Frank, just the fact that the dictator of Spain was a guy named Frenchy French.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, yeah, so yeah, yeah. It's just, there's just so much there with the Frankish legacy, and that it seems like that whenever you study high and early medieval Western Europe, the more you dig, you just find even more connections with the Carolingians and the Merovingians and the Franks. It's just that it's a legacy that cannot be exaggerated. And it's so rare for a single culture to have this much influence, especially when this culture no longer exists. And so, yeah, that's why it's just such a fun topic. And I really hope our listeners had as much fun with this as we did. Well, yeah, thank you so much again, Natasha. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate you lending your time for us today.
Yes, thank you, seriously.
I just want to say thank you guys for having me on. You guys already know I love this topic and I had a great time. And if you're interested in being a guest, you feel like you know something, you should definitely reach out and be like me.
If anybody would like to follow Natasha, her @ is Bone30 on Twitter. She's one of the coolest people around, unbelievably knowledgeable. And this has really been a great episode. Anybody waiting for more interwar content, that is coming very soon.
Watch the space.
Yes, watch this space. The next couple of weeks, we'll be putting our interwar episodes out. If anybody has any suggestions for an episode topic for our interwar series, just drop me a line. We would love to brainstorm. And if you know anybody who might want to be a guest, hit up our DMs. All right. Well, this has been Gladiator for Europe, signing off.
Later.